Hello, I'm a man of Earth, and welcome to The Real Patriarchy, Part 2. To begin, I'd like to share a video from the patriarchal capital of the world, that is, Saudi Arabia. Now I have to warn you, the following images are disturbing and viewer discretion is advised. I'm serious. You're about to witness some hardcore patriarching. Brace yourself.
حلال يروع بعد من اول انا ما معيز بهلو اي اي اللي ما شدوا لها الحين
I know, that was pretty awful. Now, the important thing you have to keep in mind here is that the man on the phone is, as conventional wisdom would have us believe, an evil, oppressive, patriarchal monster whose sole mission in life is to abuse and degrade the woman on the other end of the line, along with any woman he may happen across, at all costs. But what did that video really show? I know that I can only tell you what I see, but I think I just witnessed a man who is, at the very least, moderately invested in the emotional well-being of the woman on the other end of the line. I believe I just witnessed a man who desperately does not want the woman he's speaking with to believe that he's being unfaithful. But why? Aren't Saudi men all a bunch of misogynistic, woman-hating monsters? Aren't Saudi women the most oppressed and subjugated people in the history of, well, people? Well, I did some digging in order to find out. That digging brought me to the Unicef page on gender equality profiles, or GEP, of Middle Eastern and North African nations, which provides statistics on the status of gender equality in developing countries in this region. I looked specifically at the stats of the United Arab Emirates. Now, I have to admit, the page was last updated in 2012, and things have changed rather drastically in that region since then, to say the least. But given that Arab states have remained relatively untouched by the spike in violence, I'm not going to be too quick to just dismiss the data. Still, take it with a grain of salt. You can find more up-to-date data on the World Bank page, link will be in the description box below, which actually doesn't vary too much from what I found on the UNICEF page by much, and was last updated this year, 2016. I'm not using the World Bank stats because they are an absolute nightmare to parse, so I'll be going with the easier to read and screen cap UNICEF data. And because this is UNICEF, whose mission statement is to seek, quote, long-term humanitarian and developmental assistance to children and mothers in developing countries, you know this is going to be a fairly unbiased and non-agenda driven study, because, you know, boys are considered children too. Wait. What are you doing there? Fuck out of here. Don't you know nobody cares about you? Now, the first thing that I'd expect to find in a good old-fashioned patriarchy would be a disproportionate life expectancy between males and females. I mean, surely, if women in Saudi Arabia are as undervalued and held in as low regard as most people seem to think they are, then their life expectancies must be significantly shorter than that of their male counterparts. Except that the data shows that Saudi women live, on average, 2 years longer than Saudi men, which is actually par for the course in terms of women outliving men. In fact, according to the 2015 revision of the United Nations World Population Prospects, of the 200 states and territories listed, only one, Swaziland, has men living on average 1.15 years longer than women. 1 in 200. I'll allow you to infer from that what you will. Back to Saudi Arabia. Now you might be thinking to yourself, of course women live longer. These evil old men are just marrying girls off at the age of 9 and passing them around as broodmares for as long as possible and treating these poor Saudi women no better than chattel. Except that, as of 1995 at least, the mean age of marriage for women was 24, and for men, 27. Now, as a side note, this actually confused me a bit. That is, why UNICEF would use data that was almost 2 decades old with the 1995 data, when newer data has been available since at least 2001. The 2001 data sees a rise in the mean marriage age for women to between 25 to 29, and for men, 30 to 34. This really struck me as odd, and I can't figure out why UNICEF decided to do this. Anyway, back to the study. Now, being chattel, Saudi women must be chained to beds, cranking out children non-stop. Except, the total fertility rate of Saudi women as of 2009 was 1.9, just below the replenishment rate. In fact, virtually all of the 4.4% annual population growth rate in the UAE between 2000 and 2009 stemmed from expat workers. It shocked me to discover that only about 20% of the United Arab Emirates population were actual UAE citizens. And I'm willing to bet $1 that I can accurately guess where the large number of human rights violations the UAE is infamous for is stemming from. Now let's look at their legal framework, shall we? The laws in the United Arab Emirates are based on Islamic law, Sharia, and are influenced by Egyptian code and French civil law. The court system comprises Sharia courts and civil courts. The personal status law, which is based on Sharia and regulates matters such as marriage, divorce, and child custody, was enacted in 2005. Before 2005, no codified personal status or civil law existed. In criminal matters, a woman's testimony is worth half of that of a man before a court. Now, I actually did some digging into this claim in particular and found many conflicting reports. Some claims state that this 2 women for every man convention only applies in matters involving money, while other claims state that it is essentially baked into all criminal proceedings. For the sake of simplicity, I'll just take the UNICEF report at face value. However, I'll refrain from throwing stones, considering it wasn't until 1973 that all female United States citizens were allowed to serve on juries. Or rather, it wasn't until 1973 that women lost their special exemption status from having to serve on juries, all in the name of, wait for it, protecting women from the often grisly realities of criminal trials. Continuing. In some civil matters, a woman's testimony is equal to that of a man. And as I've stated earlier, a large proportion of the population in UAE consists of expat workers. Only about 20% of the population are actual UAE citizens. Now moving on to divorce rights. While an Emirati man can divorce his wife for any reason, women can request a divorce only under specific circumstances. It is also possible for a woman to seek divorce without the burden of evidence, but she will then have to return her dowry. Well, now that sounds absolutely terrible. Why should this poor Saudi woman have to forfeit all the benefits of being married when she's no longer married? Moving on. The latter type of divorce, called the Khula, was introduced as an option in the codified personal status law of 2005. Women have the right to financial support after a divorce, if they did not forfeit this right in exchange for a divorce, according to the UAE's initial CEDAW report of 2008. Guardianship and custody rights. Upon divorcing, a woman may be granted custody of her daughters until they reach the age of 13, and her sons until they reach the age of 10. After this, a court will reassess custody. Son of a bitch. You mean to tell me in this patriarchy of patriarchies, women still have access to their children? Inheritance rights. Okay, here comes the oppression. Women have the right to inherit. The fuck? But the share of the woman's inheritance will be half of the man's if there's one male and one female inheritor with the same relationship to the deceased. Now, I have to wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that Saudi women have no real financial obligations to anyone but themselves, if that. There are limited circumstances under which women might receive equal shares of their male counterparts. For example, in the case of parents of a childless descendant. Freedom of movement. The Constitution guarantees freedom of movement, but according to the Women's Rights in Middle East and North Africa report, in practice, a woman can be stopped from traveling abroad. Very well, I'm just going to take your word for that and ignore every Saudi woman I see outside of the UAE. Protection from child marriage. The legal minimum age of marriage is 18 for girls and boys. But child brides. The prospective husband and the woman's guardians are parties to the marriage contract. The woman's signature is also required. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you need the chattel signature? Polygyny is also legal. Islamic law has identified conditions for polygyny in terms of number, alimony, justice between wives, and consent of women. What? Wait, what? Alimony? Justice? Consent? Why do these have anything to do in relation to women in the patriarchy of almighty patriarchies? Protection from gender-based violence. Rape is considered a serious crime that is punishable by death if the crime led to the death of the victim. I am so very, very disappointed in this patriarchy. Otherwise, the penalty is imprisonment from several years up to life. Yet, the victim of rape also risks being prosecuted for extramarital relations if she willingly engaged herself in extramarital relations. Now, I'll understand if that sentence did not make any sense to you. In fact, it took me several read-throughs for my brain to return to its normal position after reading that. You see, a sleight of hand has just occurred. You see, you, the reader, are supposed to be left thinking, oh man, that's awful. You mean to tell me rape victims are being prosecuted? Which is technically true. What we're not told is that all sex outside of marriage is a crime in the UAE. Now, with that in mind, let's continue with this report on gender-based violence. There is no law against domestic violence, and marital rape is not addressed by the penal code. That might have something to do with the fact that rape is considered to be all the sex that's happening outside of marriage. In fact, the penal code allows men to discipline their children and wives using violence. Now let me be absolutely clear here, just for the slow. I in no way, shape, or form endorse any kind of domestic violence. I believe everyone should keep their hands to themselves and talk their problems through. Barring this, if this is an impossibility, then you should just go your separate ways. Now, with that out the way, I do have to point out, since this study words this in a way as to suggest that Saudi men can just take a crowbar to their wives for undercooking the steak, there are rules in place governing this. Now, once again, I am not defending this. I'm just pointing out that if the husband leaves anything even resembling a mark on his wife, he's pretty much screwed. If you want to get a good idea of what's acceptable, just go watch an old episode of I Love Lucy. Now, moving on to institutions and mechanisms. In the UAE, the Ministry of Social Affairs is responsible for social policies related to women and children. The main national organization that promotes the advancement of women is the General Women's Union. Kind of odd that a society that operates on the subjugation of women would have a government institution promoting their advancement, but, whatever. And the state has established and supported shelters, social support centers, and a telephone hotline for women who are victims of violence. Okay, considering that Saudi men aren't allowed anywhere near women, the United Arab Emirates is really starting to sound like a feminist utopia. Okay, now there's just one more part I'd like to draw some attention to before I start bringing this video to a close, and that is education and economic participation. According to data from 2005, 97% of female youth and 94% of male youth are literate. The net enrollment ratios of girls and boys in primary schools are roughly equal, 89% for girls and 90% for boys, according to data from 2009. This is also the case in secondary school, where the net enrollment ratio is 84% for girls and 82% for boys. Gross enrollment data in tertiary education shows higher enrollment rates for women than for men, 41% compared to 22%. I'm not even surprised anymore. I guess it's hard to pursue higher education when all your female relatives are financially dependent on you. And finally, access to financial credit. Women and men have equal rights to access bank loans and other forms of financial credit, and women do not require the permission of their husband or father to obtain a loan or other forms of credit. Worst patriarchy ever.